Thank you very much if you're joining in. We're just waiting for a couple of minutes until everybody gets settled and we'll start. Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this evening. It's great to see many people here in person and online. And yes, so COP27 now has finished, and what's happening, what's going to take place afterwards. So we have 6 great speakers that were at COP27. And I'll introduce them in a minute. I'll introduce myself first, which I forgot. My name is Dr. Antoinette Nestor, and one of the engagement managers for Cambridge Zero and also for the Centre for Climate Repair. And it's an honor to be sharing this session. So as I said, we have 6 speakers, and online we have Tolullah Oni. She's the Clinical Director of Research, Global Diet and Activity Research Group for MRC Epidemiology Unit. We also have Nina Siga, Research Director for Sustainable Finance, Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. And Beverly Cornaby, Program Director, Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership as well. And here in person, and it's not all on purpose and the ladies are on the screen and the men are here, but we have Tejas Rao. He's a PhD student in International Environmental Law at the Department of Land Economy. Dominic Brennan, PhD student in Nuclear Engineering at the Department of Engineering. And Patrick Carter-Cortez, PhD student in Nuclear Engineering, Department of Engineering. So thank you very much for giving your time this evening to talk about COP27 and what has happened. So the way that it will work, we'll ask one question and for you to speak for like a few minutes. And then we'll go to a next question. And in between question, you can also have a bit of a Q&A. So first of all, I'll start with Tolu. So Tolu, what achievements from COP27 gives you the most hope?
Thank you, Antoinette. I hope you can hear me okay. Sorry, can't be with you in person, especially because it's my college. I'm going to get in a lot of trouble about that. But I would say there were 3 things that really stood out for me. The first was really the prominence of health, which, is something that is, got up significantly from last year where there was the first time there was a health pavilion, to really having a really prominent discussion on the role of the health implications of climate, and also the importance of centering health as a critical component of climate action, both in terms of adaptation, but also mitigation. So I think that was really, really striking for me, and something that actually ended up getting into the final implementation plan text. The second point, which also got into the implementation plan text, was the role of youth. And I think this really stood out for me because in the parts of the world where I work, the youth are a majority demographic, and so they often either sidelined or tokenized in terms of the role that they play in climate action. So again, this year was the first time there was a youth pavilion in the Blue Zone, in the main conference area, that had the most dynamic programming in terms of really showcasing the types of actions, really practical youth-led actions that have been taking place worldwide. And this was largely led by having a youth, for the first time, a youth envoy in the COP presidency. And that actually resulted in explicit wording in the final implementation plan about encouraging parties to meaningfully engage youth in the design and implementation of climate action interventions on the ground. So that's the second. And I think the third thing that was really encouraging was the role of subnational, right? So it's the conference of parties, and the parties are national. But what really struck me was there was a significant contingency of subnational governments, so particularly in city level governments, and the kinds of forward kind of leadership actually that city level governments would have been playing and continue to play in terms of pushing, leading the way in climate resilience, and even integrating of health and climate action with things like tackling air pollution, tackling heat resilience at the city level. So that kind of leadership was really striking, and something that that we need more of, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Tolu. Now, Tejas, to you, was it actually the same? Did you see similar points, or because your area is low, was it completely different?
No, I think first off, quite similar points, but there were maybe two things that I would say probably stood out the most. The first was the development that took place on loss and damage, which I think getting loss and damage on the agenda is something that's been in negotiations for a very long time, but has either been redlined for most countries or has been bracketed very frequently. So getting it onto the agenda itself, seeing negotiations progress to the point where you've got an agreement to set up a fund is a victory in itself. But I'm sort of shying away from looking at the COP as a success just because of the fact that they've got the loss and damage fund agreed upon, because it's very rare that these things are followed through on once they're announced, or when they're followed through on, it's unclear what the timeline for that implementation really is. And I think it's really critical with something like loss and damage that this moves quickly, and that we figure out what the sources of the funding are and who can access those funds as quick as possible. So I would say the first thing that gives me optimism is the movement on loss and damage at large, but I'll caveat that with all of this. The second bit I want to highlight is probably deforestation and agriculture. I tie these two together because they saw similar timelines in negotiating, and they led to very similar work stream outcomes. So where you had the launch of, for deforestation, you basically had a formal launch of the Glasgow Partnership on deforestation, which developed out of last year, but now had 140 signatories, which shows that countries are really taking that seriously, but also that they're committed to leaving that at the grassroots level for people who are actually within forest communities to be empowered enough to control the conversation around that, which I think is quite critical. And on agriculture, the fact that agriculture has received a new lease of life in getting another 4 years to have a separate work stream under the UNFCCC to negotiate further, to look at how there is a nexus between food and climate, and that isn't forgotten, is probably quite critical for our achievement of the 2030 broader sustainable development agenda. So I think these are the three things that I'd point to, if anything at all.
Thank you, Tejas. And Nina, now to you online. What about your views?
I mean, well, obviously, loss and damage was the biggest item, I think, for everybody, and it is really a success that it's not only got onto the agenda, but there was an agreement around the fund. And yes, absolutely spot on. There is still a lot to be done in terms of understanding actually kind of how the money gets into there, how it gets implemented, what the timeline. But the fact that for the first time and forever, we actually have that text into the wording, I think is pretty great. Other issues in finance that were quite good was the opening the door to restructuring multilateral development institutions and international financing institutions as well, because effectively we have a problem with diverting finance towards emerging markets, and it's a rather massive problem at that. And one of the solutions is to allow MDBs and IFIs to de-risk those investments quite substantially, but also to think through actually what are they there to do, because they're set up, World Bank has set up been for development, and if you don't tie climate together with development, then effectively it doesn't really work. So it didn't go quite as far as we would have liked it to go, but the fact that door was open, I thought, was quite good. And the third thing, I guess, so this was built as an implementation COP, and we did have a really interesting piece of text that I thought was quite nice, which was the text around technology transfer and capacity building. Because effectively we have this issue where within developed markets, we've managed to decouple emissions and GDP growth, but we haven't done that for developing markets. And part of it, that is finance, but part of it is the fact that a lot of technologies sit in the global north, and they really need to be sitting in the global south as well. So having text in the cover decision around that, I thought was also quite important.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you very much. We know that that you have a little bit of a cold, but we're calling it the post-COP cough. I know you said a name for it before, and yeah, sort of the effects of very heavy, I was supposed to like not fumes, but it was a bit of a petrol being burned there, wasn't it? It's a bit toxic. But now you mentioned technology and capacity building, and I'm just going to turn now to Dominic in relation to what his views are, basically what achievement from COP27 gives you the most hope, given your background in technology.
Yes, thank you, Antoinette. So I probably shook more hands than I care for in the five days I was there. Majoritively, the people who came up to us were energy ministers and finance ministers from countries in the global south, for want of a better word. And for all their interests and demands in nuclear, because we had a big nuclear sign, they knew what we were about. Their first question was, how much will it cost me? So the problem with countries in the global south, they have to borrow at 14+% rate, which completely wipes out nuclear, which is already considered to be economically unsound for its expenses. So in the West right now, we are currently pursuing a private investment angle. There's several companies in the West investing in nuclear power as opposed to the countries investing in nuclear power for whichever reason they want. There are no mechanisms, I found out, for private investment for nuclear in the global south. So I spoke to a number of representatives from private infrastructure financing firms, for example. And I remember I asked one of them after their talk, and I said, you manage this £30 billion fund for private infrastructure investment in countries in Africa. Do you have any capacity or mechanism to facilitate nuclear power here? And his answer was, in the 10 years I've been doing this, that question has never been asked. So it's not even on the agenda in terms of private financing for nuclear power. Now, I can't speak for renewables and other energy mechanisms, but the feeling I got from the people who'd come and speak to us, Zimbabwe and Nigeria stand out particularly, was they want nuclear power for security reasons, for power reliability, and also from there we can also facilitate medical isotopes, for example, or agriculture. They have their benefits as well. So financing is the one point that is boiled down to when representatives from the global south come to us in nuclear power.
Thank you. And then now, Beverly, now going to you now, I don't know if you had time to actually also go to all the different pavilions, but on your view, what achievements from COP27 gives you the most hope?
So, I mean, many of the things have already been mentioned, particularly, I mean, this is, I think it's Tolly mentioned, it's the Conference of Parties, it's about the overall negotiations, and probably one of the most significant things that came out of that was the loss and damage progress. But I think one of the things that doesn't often get seen as much externally, if you're not at COP, is actually the way that the COP has actually evolved itself, and therefore going from just being the Conference of the Parties to much greater non-state actor and observer engagement. And Tolly mentioned about the youth presence there, and I have to say I think that was much higher than on generally on previous years. I know that obviously last year with COP26 they tried to have a lot more involvement. I think that has despite the limitations in the big to kind of get there, actually that has increased. I think there's also just a lot more people there that are wanting, from different aspects of society, that are wanting to have those discussions about the implementation. And certainly, as well as the country pavilions, which form, every country has the opportunity to have and to host events and to host meetings. There is a number of other pavilions that have come up. Tolly mentioned the youth one. We saw a number of food ones. There was a nature one. There was an education one. We were involved in a business one. So with the Women Business Coalition in relation to the work that we're doing. There was even a business pavilion for Egypt. There was a number that weren't actually necessarily just country delegations, but also other non-state actor voices that were there, that were part of the discussion. And from that, what we're actually seeing is a lot of alliance forming, a lot of announcements that are being made about actually how to take forward this in practice, that don't necessarily make the overall headlines, but are actually some of the successes that do happen at COP, and that enable people to come together on an international stage and actually have those discussions. So we, from my perspective, and just to introduce myself a bit more, I work primarily with business. I'm taking the voice of business, those that we consider to be more climate leaders, to government to try and change policy. And what we were able to do there was to actually have a number of discussions, bringing together policymakers, business, and other key stakeholders in discussions to look at actually how do we do this? It's not just the kind of local level, and then how does that scale up? So kind of, there is the overall negotiations, but there's also that kind of level happening where you've got much more of those kind of, quite rich discussions, rich agreements being made that are actually then kind of happening and showing that this is being done in practice. And I think that is really important. And we hear about some of them because some announcements do get made, and we try to certainly capture some of those and be able to share some of those, some of the most significant ones. But I think there's probably also a lot that we don't hear about. And I think it's those things that we need to try and, share more, and that needs to come out of COP more, because that is where the change will really happen. In terms of, yes, we need the leadership signals from the top, from the negotiations, and we can come on to some of the unfortunate failures with that as well this time. But at the same time, we do also need that leadership from all levels, and that is where we're seeing that coming through.
Thank you, Beverly. Indeed, I had many conversations as well in the pavilions and with people, and what I've seen as well compared to the previous COPs is that there's much more importance now given to that sort of the presence of having many events within certain pavilions. I know, Tolu, you were with the WHO pavilion, and then you were with the women business. Universities also have different pavilions, so there's a lot taking place. And for you now, Patrick, and you were part, I believe, on the same sort of group. So what about for you? How was for you, and what you see were the positives of it?
So I'd start, the biggest positive for me as a nuclear engineer was that this was the first year that the International Atomic Energy Agency was invited in a formal capacity to have a pavilion at COP. And I think that's a very big step to including nuclear energy as part of the transition that we're all talking about. So that's something that gave me a lot of hope, is the fact that for many years I think the conversation has been about renewable energy, which is very important. But evidence shows that we're not getting to renewables having the effect that we hoped they would have as quickly as possible. And this is fundamentally a climate crisis. It's not a renewability crisis. We're not changing from fossil fuels because they're running out. We're changing from them because they're damaging our planet. So to have that perspective that we need to focus on clean energy and transitioning faster in order to achieve the goals that we have set, I think that was the thing that gave me the greatest hope. And then on an individual level, we had conversations with people from all over: Brazil, Bolivia, Tunisia, Equatorial Guinea, Egypt. Every country you could think of is present at COP. So that's an opportunity to have conversations with people that you wouldn't ordinarily meet. So I'd encourage everyone here, clearly if you're at this event, you have an interest in climate change, and you're, as students, perhaps working on research and such, it's a great opportunity to have these conversations, interact with people, and it's a very friendly atmosphere. This was something that I was surprised about, because as a nuclear engineer, we face a lot of hate, frankly. And there were some horror stories from other activities that people did with outreach. So we were like aware, be careful, stay in twos and stuff like that. But it was actually a really great atmosphere. People are really receptive to having conversations. And yeah, it was lots of very interesting discussions.
Thank you. And then before we proceed to the next session of, basically this is the good bit, to the kind of like the bad part of what you didn't like, are there any questions from the public at this stage or online? Yes, Charlie, you have the microphone, have 2 questions there. And if you're online as well, please feel free to put questions on the Q&A session, and we'll be reading it as well. Thank you.
Cool. Hi, yeah, so my name's George. I was lucky enough to be at COP as well with the group called the UK Youth Climate Coalition. I think the context of COP27 was obviously quite specific and being hosted in Egypt, and COP28 will be quite similar, being hosted in Dubai. And there were, I think, two major issues that kind of came across from this. One was that there was a perception, I think, from some people that the presidency wasn't pushing as hard necessarily as the UK presidency had been at COP26 for a progressive, kind of very ambitious text on the cover decision. So in the end, we saw quite a lot of trade-offs between, on the one hand, the great establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund, but on the other hand, very weak language on the mitigation work program, like global goal on adaptation and that kind of stuff. And I'm sure those who were unfortunate enough to be still there on Friday night and Saturday morning would have seen the chaos around the fact that these texts were only being published, say, 20 minutes before the closing plenaries and that kind of stuff. There was a lot of, I suppose, complaints about the real commitment to force through on the hard issues. And I suppose the second kind of related issue that we had, particularly as youth activists at COP, was that it wasn't necessarily the most nurturing space for civil society actors this time around, particularly as youth delegates that were pushing hard on human rights issues related to, on the one hand, the case of Alaa Abdel El Fattah, who's the imprisoned prisoner of conscience in Egypt, but also on things like Palestinian land rights and this kind of stuff. At every corner we met with kind of men in suits with Egyptian host country badges and kind of undercover security in our meetings. I think a few people had been concerned about whether their phone had been hacked as well. All of the Fridays for Future activists had an external security consultant that advised them to make sure that they had someone who knew that they were going through security on the way home because of concerns around essentially like what repercussions advocacy on human rights might have had within the COP space. And I think those things are, I suppose, ultimately linked towards the leaders of the conference. So I think what would be useful to hear from the panelists, I suppose, is how you think those concerns can be remedied over the next year or so as we lead up to the next COP that will face many of the same issues around being hosted in a country that's very reliant on fossil fuel income, also a state that's maybe not traditionally a thriving area for civil society and youth activists.
Thank you very much. And I believe there was a question on the back there. Yes?
Thank you. My name is Emerson Joao. I have a question about the nuclear technology in Global South. So you mentioned about financing, but one of the challenges also is how to bring such critical technology to Global South, right? There is compliances that need to go through. We're talking about places where there are still conflicts, and you don't want to give such a great technology, but also risky one to unstable regions. So have you discussed about it? Is it something that was discussed during COP? And also about the loss and damage, so that's a very good one. However, we still don't have like pathways of implementation. So my question is, do you think, and there are many agreements like that on COP, do you think that COP is still the best place to talk about those things? Because you have an agreement, but then we don't have like real pathways to actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, that's a very good question, which ties up to what the next question is like what failures from COP27 concerns you the most. So I'll go first. Nina, would you like to tackle that point first, and hopefully your voice will last. Let us know if it doesn't.
So I have to admit, our sound has been coming in and out during the entirety. So what I think you're asking me is, what are my worries and concerns coming out of this COP heading into kind of COP28? So it's it's a difficult one. And yes, it was sort of COP27 was very different from the Glasgow COP in many regards. I think, Glasgow, when you exited the venue, you could feel the energy of the movement around you. You could see the crowds, you can feel their passion for what was happening. I think, Sharm El-Sheikh was a very different type of environment. I think that's absolutely spot on. I think there was quite a lot of disappointment around the language on 1.5 degrees, which was a copy and paste from Glasgow, as opposed to any sort of any sort of increased ambition. And it was perhaps an even bigger disappointment because halfway through the process, the G20 communique actually had quite good 1.5 degree language in it. And so to land almost exactly where we started was a bit of an issue. And obviously, again, it's the same with the fossil fuel language. It's always really hard to predict what happens at COPs, because going into COP27, I think the expectations were super low. So, when we were preparing to go, we had a lot of worries about actually who will show up, whether business and finance will even be there, whether there will be anything agreed there. So and from that perspective, it feels like what was achieved has exceeded the expectations, and maybe that's where the trick is. If you keep your expectations quite low, then it's harder to be disappointed. I think, given UAE is where it is, I suspect it'll be a challenging COP in terms of language around fossil fuels. I have some hope that there is, that they will look to do a lot of innovation on the ground, and perhaps that's where they will look to make their mark. I think there's also a certain competitiveness spirit developing from just what we're seeing already now in terms of the number of delegates that they'll be looking to welcome into COP28, which will be a lot more than in Egypt. So perhaps that will play a role, but it's certainly, I guess we're talking about COPs and this conversation, absolutely, but it's not as if any work that happens only during this kind of 2 weeks in the year, right? So a lot of the text that came into the cover text opened the door for work to take place through the year. And it's the same on financing and on MDBs and the World Bank meetings that need to take place. It's the same on thinking through loss and damage. It's the same on going through and progressing further on global goals for adaptation and actually resetting that mitigation goal going from billions to trillions. So while I think COP28 will be very important, it's almost more important what is going to happen in the next year and how we run up to it.
Thank you, Nina. And now, Tejas, I'll turn to you now for the question in the audience. Apologies, I didn't get your name. In relation to the issue of the Global South, would you like to take?
I think Dominic and Patrick are better qualified to answer on the technology aspects of it. I'd actually just like to answer the question about the presidency, if that's okay. So I think it is right that the presidency didn't commit to as much at the start. And they activated probably a lot later. Like I think Carbon Brief has this tracker that shows that they activated maybe around Friday night when the first draft came out, and then the second elemental text, the first element list came out on Friday, the second element list came out on the Tuesday, and then you had a first draft on Thursday before drafts proceeded very quickly after that. But I think the part to remember with the presidency is that the cover decision is effectively a political bargain. It's not a legal bargain. It's not the bargain that actually gets the work done. It's the bargain that is agreed to as a barter or as a compromise to help the COP close successfully, more than anything else. And I think that the work that actually took place within the subcommittees, within the SBI, within the Substar. And you saw a lot of progress taking place over there that led to decisions that are enforceable. I think the part that doesn't get as much attention is the agreement on the rules with the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee, where you now suddenly have this mechanism that will allow you to actually implement the NDCs or to facilitate the NDCs being implemented. So that's the first thing. So on the presidency, I think the valid observation, and there is cause for concern about how active the UAE is going to be, but I have optimism there, only because the Egyptian presidency also suffered for geopolitical reasons, suffered also because of location, suffered for other issues that aren't going to get highlighted as much. On the space for civil actors and youth at the next COP, that's also a space I have a lot more expectation from the United Arab Emirates, not in the least because of the way that the demographic in the Middle East is changing at large, where you've got a population that is much younger now than was in the past. Migrants into the Middle East are also much younger than they have been traditionally, historically, as a result of which I'm expecting the UAE to welcome a lot more. And to also turn our attention to what that might mean for the agenda at large, I think that I echo Nina's comments about how potentially you're going to have tricky conversations around fossil fuels. But given what I saw from this year's UAE Pavilion and the fact that 70% of their delegation was made up of fossil fuel leaders, I am anticipating that conversation to be more about how the same individuals can be given charge of the just transition effectively, because with the energy economy, what you typically see is that the same individuals are in control of multiple sources of energy. And this is particularly true in petrostates and states that have been reliant on fossil fuels at large. As a result of which, the 70% that controls fossil fuels is likely to be the percent that wants to be in charge of whatever source we transition to. And I suspect that the conversation is going to be more about how to make that happen rather than much else. So I think that's my response on the presidency, and I'll defer to Dominic and Patrick on the global side.
Sure. Yes, wonderful question. We were asked that quite often. So to speak to your first point, which is just giving the technology, completely correct. We can't just vouchsafe some technology. We can't airdrop in a reactor, say, here you go, have fun, and we go away. Or similarly, we build a ring fence around the reactor, we will manage it for you. That very much overlooks the third pillar of international support, which is pride. You have to sustain and build the pride of the country you're investing to. You can't just bulldozer over everything that they are. So it's very much a complete systems approach. They don't want the technology. They want the technology, the education, the transfer of knowledge, and just the whole industry. To speak to your second point, it's a very timely point, especially in Ukraine. But we have to be careful not to tar with the same brush the entire Global South. Global South is a painful term to use because there's so much variety in the entirety of Africa and South America, for example. So quite right, we shouldn't just be throwing reactors in war zones or things or areas that are potential to be war zones, but similarly, we cannot discredit these areas. Typically, these are areas of war zones because of poverty, because of energy poverty. And so to deny them their opportunity is compounding the problem. So although we shouldn't be going and giving them these reactors or giving them this transfer of knowledge, it's conversations to be had. And I think Patrick can speak more to that point.
Yes, I do have some thoughts. So first of all, the way the infrastructure of nuclear in the world, nuclear technology in the world works, it's highly regulated by the IAEA. Few industries are so controlled from the beginning, mining of the uranium, through to the very end of nuclear waste control for like thousands of years. So from that perspective, there's an international control of the entire life cycle of fissile material. That for one side. And then a fact that I don't think many people know, coming to Dom's point about what is the Global South, is that Argentina produces 8% of their electricity with nuclear. Brazil produces 2%, Mexico 2%. The technology already exists in South America. It's a matter of expanding it. Same in South Africa. South Africa has 1 or 2 nuclear power plants that produce a significant base load of their demand. Egypt is building a new power plant. The minister of Ghana said at the IAEA Pavilion, energy minister, that by 2050, half of Ghana's electricity will be nuclear. A minister from Kenya said something similar. A minister from Nigeria also shared these thoughts. Another thing is the IAEA, in part of what it does, has training centers. There's one in Trieste that Dom and I have been to, but there's also one in Ghana that produces PhDs and master's degrees in everything you can think of nuclear. So the African continent is producing all these nuclear engineers that don't have necessarily a job in the industry because the industry hasn't met up to the educational opportunities that are already available. So on the one hand, when we talk about, is it safe to give these countries nuclear technology? Well, the fact is that nuclear technology is already there. It's just a matter of they don't necessarily have the funds to expand the energy part, which is the main cause of CO2 emissions. And then the other thing that it's very important to point out is, I think history is a very valuable resource. In 1992, China had no nuclear technology. They decided that this was something they were going to pursue, so they got people from France, very long established history in nuclear, to come and build a reactor. And this is a turnkey model. So the first nuclear power plant in China, the Chinese didn't run it. The French came, they ran it for them. But then between then and now, China is now producing new reactors that we don't have anywhere else in the world. They have built the technological capabilities to develop nuclear technology in-house. And that's, within our lifetimes. So the point I'm trying to make is that, yes, it is a challenge, perhaps, mentally to conceptualize how countries can become nuclear developed nations, but China is a great example of that. And then another example I'd like to point out is in the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, you had lots of countries that had nuclear technology, such as Lithuania, Latvia, etc., that were arguably in a fragile state politically. There was a lot of who's running the country and, what's going to happen. And even then, when nuclear technology could have been in rogue hands, so to speak, nothing bad happened, not because of luck, but because the IAEA has safeguards in place to ensure that technology, even in unstable countries, is protected and can't be weaponized, can't be made into something dangerous. So I think those are plenty arguments for why developing countries should pursue nuclear, if they want to.
Thank you. And now, Tolu, when the panelists here were speaking, I saw you nodding a few times at different times. So what failure from COP27 concerned you the most? And then as well, I know you had different events going, and I'm not sure if you were there for the 2 weeks or not, but all the events, they were wow, they were really, really good. So if you can also as well explain a little bit what you did there, that would be quite good.
So did you say end with what I did do at COP?
As well, so you could actually, what failures you see in relation to COP27, but also explain the audience as well about your pavilion, which you had very good sort of involvement as well.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so the point about one of the key points that has come through here is around inclusion. The first comment that was made around civil society, and even Nina's point around thinking back to last year and the energy, I think that can't be underplayed in terms of the pressure that places on negotiators. It's really critical to feel that going into a negotiation every day or every minute of the day, that there is this pressure in terms of the advocacy for any given topic, and that was significantly lacking. So one of the critical things that could definitely be done better is around that inclusion, particularly the civil society. Just, I think, really highlighting the power of the physical form of where, so we're talking about the content, but the way actually the physical form of the conference is shaped. This year, the green zone, which is the civil society space, was completely separate and away from the conference, which is where it's open to the public, where anyone can participate. And that was that physical design really did not foster inclusion. I think that was very palpable. The other aspect is the financial inclusion. So really just how much it costs. I'm saying very practical things here, but this is what actually ends up playing out in terms of who can participate to get their accommodation, to eat, some really practical things here in terms of designing for inclusion requires thinking about that. So I think that was something that was quite a disappointment. The second is around the implementation. So I absolutely agree that that getting loss and damage on the text is a big win. That said, I would have liked to see a little bit more about the pathway, and the reason why that is critical is because from what we know about the Green Climate Fund that currently exists, one of the prevailing conversations that came through in a lot of the conversations I had, particularly with government officials, particularly from, or exclusively from different countries in African region particularly, was that there is this Green Climate Fund, but actually your ability to access it requires a whole host of other technical skills that almost is designed to retain the money in outside of the global south, quote unquote. So the way that the fund is implemented is so critical to seeing who actually gets access to it. And so yes, for loss and damage, but I would have liked to see that it's not going to be implemented in exactly the same way as the Green Climate Fund, because already there was a lot of conversation about financing, not just for loss and damage, but actually increasing commitments to the Green Climate Fund, but and critically the mechanisms for accessing it at the moment is very exclusive. So I think that's the second aspect of implementation, the detail. And I think the last aspect is dissonance. There's a couple of aspects of dissonance there. One of it is, which was alluded to, around just the sheer presence of the fossil fuel industry and fossil lobby. And I'm inclined to agree with the comment that was shared earlier in terms of what is likely to happen next year. And I think it's just the power of the presence of that. I think that there was a big dissonance there. The other dissonance from a health perspective that I think we should highlight was this Coca-Cola sponsorship. Coca-Cola that is both a significant polluter in terms of plastic polluter globally, and a significant driver of thinking about health and climate action of ill health from rising non-communicable diseases. This is really critical. There was a quite a significant amount of advocacy, and there was some announcement that the sponsorship had been withdrawn, but actually on the ground there was far too much of that about. And it really, we know there's a lot of evidence that your food environment shapes the behavior. And I had lots of anecdotal, I don't know, I'd be interested to hear what people think here, but it was so freely available. It was suffocating. So I think that amount of dissonance is something that I know from the health contingency delegation at COP were very vocal on this dissonance, and I think something that should be actively pushed back against for next year.
Thank you, Tolu. And Beverly, was it the same for you? Did you see something similar? Was it not your experience, or do you have a different point in relation to what failure from COP27 you saw?
I mean, I have to say I agree on the affordability and actually the accessibility, those points definitely. And in terms of actually what became freely available drinks was because actually the lack of available food and drink, I think at the very beginning of the COP, and actually just which comes down to the preparedness of the country to be able to host and to be able to understand actually how many people they've got coming, what the expectations are in terms of actually feeding them, what looks like healthy food. And I have to say, one of the things that we did in the lead up to COP26 and working with the UK government was really try and actually put pressure, and I know others did too. And I think this comes to the pressure point that Tolly was mentioning, that actually that pressure is very important on the government that is hosting to be able to make it as sustainable as they can do and make sure that there are sustainable food options, sustainable drink options, and that actually it's considering the impact of the conference itself, and then also how it does its negotiations. So one of the things that I know was very successful for the UK government was, external organizations such as ourselves, putting pressure on them to make sure that they had a certain level of expectation in terms of an ambition level and kind of, you know, even the commitments that those businesses were making in terms of actually who were the sponsors, who was therefore directly involved, who they had as, you know, the businesses that they engaged with directly. So they had a COP26 business leaders group, and, you know, who was on that was very important for them to consider in terms of those businesses' impact and actually their role in the transition. And I think that pressure is missing from other governments. You know, Egypt, I mean, there is, you know, I think it comes up in terms of actually the youth voice, the activism voice. You know, there was, I mean, it was great actually to see that there was a march, a Saturday march, but the UNFCCC allowed it to happen through the blue zone because it just wasn't necessarily feasible to have it outside of there, to therefore maintain the safety of those that were taking part in that march. And therefore it was allowed to happen, but it wasn't the usual way. And it wasn't the way certainly we saw at Glasgow, which was, you know, marching on the street and making that, you know, that really vocal and kind of media vocal as well. So having that kind of being able to kind of put that pressure externally in terms of what was happening internally with the COP. And I do think it's not clear how that will happen at UAE and how that pressure will happen. I do think though that they, you know, I see that their ambition level may be greater in terms of what they want as success. And certainly there were things coming through at this COP where they were probably talking about things that I think points, you know, to some of the points that come up in terms of technology, innovation, where they will want themselves to be seen as, you know, ambitious on this and kind of pushing on the right places. I think one of the things that has kind of been alluded to that I see as one of the biggest failures is around the, you know, taking forward the commitments that were made at COP26, which the UK did successfully get the Glasgow Climate Pact. Their negotiators worked really hard to be able to achieve that. And as Nina said, a lot of that happened actually in advance of COP. It didn't necessarily happen at COP itself, but COP is, you know, helps seal that because you've got everyone in the room and therefore you're able to have those discussions. But I think what we've seen is, you know, that hasn't gone forward. The level of commitments coming, you know, from countries, that increased ambition even on implementation, if they've already got, you know, higher level of commitments. We're not, you know, there's been a few come forward, but not enough. And I think that's the thing that's going to be quite critical because we need to keep on track to 1.5. You know, we helped, you know, we supported with organizing the business voice ahead of the G20 to kind of show that actually there was real support from the, you know, the economy for keeping on track to 1.5. And I think it's going to be, you know, critical next year is can they bring that ambition level? Can they kind of support in terms of that, getting that agreement to kind of get stronger text on the mitigation? And I do think there are things that, you know, we're pushing for, such as, you know, we saw the UK government created really strong networks through the FCDO, their embassies, to be able to have that pressure. And we want that to continue in terms of actually what's happening on UK policy, because we see that they still have a role to play where some other governments may not have those networks, may not be as strong in that sense. And so therefore the UK can still, you know, kind of support and take a lead on that where, you know, the host country itself may not be able to take that leadership as strongly because they haven't necessarily got those networks that have been developed by the UK during their time as COP host. But at this, yeah, so I think there are some, you know, I have to say we came away from it probably like Nina said, you know, kind of, we had such low expectations that any successes were seen as good successes, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that actually there aren't a lot of things that we flagged as, you know, needs work on for future COPs.
Thank you, Beverly. And then this is anecdotally as well in relation to the inclusion and access. We had a speaker that she was due to fly from an African country, and she couldn't because when she got to get her ticket, she was told the ticket she had, it was not the right one because she was going to COP. She actually had to pay business class and no any other ticket. So we managed to get her a video of her participation, but that was just not right. In a way, you feel very powerless in relation to why, like, airlines will take advantage of people going to COP from certain countries. And also with the local, they had a few chats with people working there. And many of them, they had no idea what was taking place. They knew that it was like a big event, but it was like, well, what is this COP27? What do you mean with this COP27? You mean that it's climate change that if we stop using petrol, we won't have any money. So even the local participation or understanding what was taking place was not there. And spoke to a few people in the hotels and also within the different communities, and I got the same response. So it was something that remains to be seen how it's going to pan out for next year. But from the audience, are there any other questions as to any of the points? Yes, please, Charlie or Andrew.
So my question is, if the purpose of COP, right, is to deal with the climate emergency we're having, is this okay? If the purpose of COP is to deal with the climate emergency we're having, to keep us within 1.5 degrees, all these other, tents we're talking about as great successes, discussions about health, although they're all really important, is there not a way that having these conversations means we're not discussing enough about how to effectively mitigate against climate change, and how allowing such a presence for these still very important but maybe not the focus topics allows us to feel we've had a success without actually tackling the important core issue here, which is how to stop emissions and how to stop 1.5 degrees, which most people say have already missed anyway. Yeah.
Thank you. Nina, would you like to start with that? Oh,
Sure.
and Tolu. Okay, so Nina and Tolu. Okay.
So I'll let Tolu defend the health bit. That's squarely her territory. So the issue with this, it's a very particular perspective, right? If we think about the history of the climate emergency, effectively we have caused it, right? UK, US. So effectively, when we're talking about things like loss and damage, it's a key issue to the mitigation discussion. We can't be talking about driving to 1.5 degrees and talking about mitigation without considering very practical issues that a lot of the vulnerable countries are already facing, and very practical impacts that they already are dealing with, where effectively they're paying the price for our development. Right? So from that perspective, loss and damage and conversation around adaptation is absolutely key to us being able to move anywhere on mitigation. And it's part of it is around how do we mitigate? Part of it is around how do we finance mitigation in most vulnerable countries? How do we find ways for these countries to still develop quite fast to get them to the level of development that they need, while at the same time decoupling that from emissions. So I think you're right that our overarching goal is to keep ourselves within 1.5 degrees. That is absolutely spot on. However, unless we solve these other major issues, there will be no negotiation because it is part of a single whole.
Thank you, Nina. Tolu and then Tejas. Okay, Tolu.
Yes, and Nina, I think that's really spot on. And I think building on that, a really critical part of this and actually getting any action is that trust, and is that ability to cooperate, to say we all want to work together on this. I think it's all well and good as a saying, okay, we all need to get to 1.5, but as Nina mentioned, there's a justice issue that has to be confronted in order for everyone to be working together to achieve that 1.5 issue. Very proximally, health is a really critical part of that, thinking about the pathway, because this is something that is palpable in as much as the adaptation and the financing of the impact of climate change is a very proximal issue to the most vulnerable and the kind of emerging economies. Similarly, the health argument is a profound one for why climate action is so urgent. And in my work, not just in my work, actually, there's a significant body of and growing evidence to show that actually centering health into climate action and thinking about climate mitigation achieves more in terms of accelerating the impact of climate action as well as in addition to the health co-benefits. So the action, even when we're talking about health, is not just purely because we're hijacking the conversation separately, but it serves two purposes. It humanizes and it brings to the fore the human cost of climate action, which is actually a really good argument for affecting change. And secondly, because we know that the pathways, as you say, to achieving that 1.5, because we know that centering health as a critical part of that actually achieves more in terms of climate action in addition to the co-benefits. So I think for those two reasons, that's the reason why. Those are the reasons why the health pavilion is so increasingly prominent. And it brings people to the table, right? You know, when you're in places where you just, yes, we're talking about climate, people talking about now. Okay, what is happening now is our human development is lagging. And one of the critical reasons that human development is lagging is because of the climate, particularly adaptation. So bringing in that argument is a really powerful one for setting a pathway to 1.5.
Thank you, Tolu. Tejas and then Beverly.
Yeah. I think that's a very good question, only because I would take health as being an example of conversations that people might criticize, but I don't think it should be. There's a couple of reasons for that, and I think that the first thing is the way that you characterized the COP as being the place where you take stock of climate action. That's not necessarily true. The COP isn't meant to be a place where you just take stock of climate action, but it's meant to be a place where you look at where progress to the UNFCCC at large is made, and you look at what progress is required on the UNFCCC. And I think people forget that you're looking at the UNFCCC and you're not looking at climate action exclusively. And if you look at the legal text of the UNFCCC, you'll see mention made of all related challenges. And if you look at the political context behind the UNFCCC, you'll see that it was the Rio conference that led to the UNFCCC, and the developmental challenge was pretty firm on the agenda at that point, which is one reason why all of these conversations are really important, because they speak to progress on the UNFCCC in the first instance, although from a myriad of angles. The second reason why I think that's important is because that characterization of the COP misses out what I think is the most essential part of the COP, which is the fact that you're building capacity across disciplines, and that you're building capacity in a way that builds communities of practice for the future. You look at people who are involved with the climate space now, and don't quote me on the statistics, but I suppose that 70% are returning COP goers and 30% are new into the COP community each year, or 30% get added by volume. And I think that what that does is that it creates a community of practice that is involved in negotiations, is tracking negotiations, is helping to put the kind of pressure that was referenced earlier, and is creating a vernacular across disciplines that's best described in the history of science as being a trading zone, where you've started to have conversations that can take place across disciplines just because you have the vocabulary that means the same thing to people across disciplines now. Climate adaptation, climate mitigation, for example, resilience, risk measurement, are all things that meant different things to lawyers, to negotiators, to scientists. And we've now gotten to a point where it means the same thing, which is why I think these side conversations are really important, because even if they sit on the side of negotiations, they're conversations that enable the vernacular and the vocabulary around climate action and climate justice to develop far quicker and to get people onto the same page in the manner they conceptualize these issues, which I think is what pushes us forward. So that's my response to that.
Thank you, Tejas. And Beverly?
I wonder if it's worth pointing out that they're not entirely exclusive attendance, right? So it's worth kind of making it clear that negotiations is not just negotiations in one place and non-negotiations in another. You actually have some cross-pollination. So you have negotiators interacting in this pavilion. So the exposure and the conversations happening in those spaces feed into negotiations directly through people interacting in those spaces, and indirectly through delegations. So you have country delegations that are maybe at the forefront of negotiations, and some that are exposed to the other spaces. So I think it is worth highlighting that explicitly, that these are not just two parallel things happening.
Thank you, Tolu. Yeah, indeed. Actually, somebody once described it as a human zoo for a laugh, and some people might agree. So, Beverly, to you now.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that point. And I think, building on what some of the others have said in terms of, we can't look at mitigation in isolation, because if you do, then you're forgetting that we live in a system, and a system has, various levers. But the thing is, climate change is having a massive impact on our world. We're seeing that now in terms of the impact on people, the impact on nature. And therefore we need to look at it as, okay, well, if we're addressing, if we're looking at mitigation, then actually how do we make sure that that doesn't, the actions we take don't negatively impact on people and nature as well. And therefore it is key to have, to have this kind of joined up conversation and making sure, and, part of that is also, we're looking at this as COP27, we're talking about COP27. COP15 is going to take place in a few weeks' time, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity. Actually, that is just as important. And certainly we've been trying to make sure we link up the narrative between both to show the connections between climate and nature. And certainly one of the things, I don't think it necessarily came out as much at this COP, although there was a nature pavilion, but certainly with the UK, when they had the presidency, they tried to make sure that nature was actually on the agenda alongside climate. And, alongside that, we're trying to make sure that people are part of that conversation. And that comes to health, as Tolly was talking about, because when you think about actually how climate impacts on people, health is the key thing, whether that's mental health, physical health, however you talk about it. But there are lots of benefits to bring. And I think you have to think about this as a bigger transition. And if you're going to make the transition, you need to bring people with you, and you need to make sure that the planet is not destroyed in the process. And we could easily do that through some things. And certainly we had a discussion, one of the, I know that Antoinette, you asked Tolly about some of the events that she did. And actually one of the events that we did was we did a roundtable that was looking at people, nature, climate. How can policy and business action deliver against all three? And this is certainly I'm seeing in my conversations that I'm having with policymakers, is actually how do you deliver, so that you actually kind of, deliver benefits for all of them. That's not to say there won't be trade-offs. And, unfortunately, our discussion did bring out some of those trade-offs. But it shows that you can't just go and put, one example we had was you can't just go and put a renewables project in and therefore not look at actually what is the impact of that renewables project. You need to make sure you're bringing the community with you. You need to make sure that also the impact on the nature and the kind of the, wherever you're putting it, that habitat is also considered, to make sure, and from the very start of those projects, to make sure that that has a positive impact, that the community engage with it, and it's seen as actually, both addressing emissions, but also addressing those other issues as well.
Thank you. Tolu, you have your hand up.
Yes, because I realized I didn't answer the second part of your question. Was just to point out that another roundtable that we had was looking at exactly this topic of centering health in the financing of sustainable urban infrastructure projects. And part of the reason is because there's quite a lot of talk around green infrastructure and urban infrastructure, but in a lot of places that are urbanizing most rapidly, these are still quite abstract terms. Oh, we're talking about, sustainability. It's like, oh yeah, it's a nice to have. And something that tends to happen in more luxury developments. Oh, this is an eco village and that sort of thing, but not the fundamental aspects of our infrastructure that influence our climate resilience. When you bring in, however, the health argument into it, it becomes something that is critical and is seen as not a nice to have. So when we're talking about transport infrastructure, how are we ensuring that it's climate resilient, but also supportive of ensuring it's not tackling something, is not contributing to something like air pollution, which both accelerates climate change and has negative impacts on people's health. It's the negative impact of people's health that often moves the dial, actually, for something like air pollution, not the emissions. The emissions is, oh yes, it's contributing to warming, and we all know it's critical. But actually, in terms of decisions on the ground, in terms of financing, it's showing that this city, that Lagos lost 3% of its GDP just to air pollution. It's showing that 60% of air pollution deaths happened in children under 5. These are the things that actually move the needle, right? It just then happens to be something that we're thinking about that both improves health and bakes in climate mitigation in the most rapidly urbanized cities. So that was a really tangible discussion to look at how to design that in, and the point that Nina made around language and bringing people together is so critical, because this is some of the things that came out with, when we talk about sustainability, there's all these standards, there's all these metrics, and everyone's talking about the different things. So when we want to actually implement there are too many things to take and we just pick one. Whereas actually, if we can streamline and talk about, well, we're actually kind of talking about the same thing, which is human development in a responsible way for the planet. So what does that mean? What does that language mean? And for that to happen, you need these different groups to come together. And maybe the last thing that we did is like, well, mention one thing. We had an exhibit because, you know, we talk about these sessions, but also these exhibits. And we had an exhibit on a citizen science project that worked with youth in Lagos, in Accra, and Cape Town. That essentially sparked the project. They designed, they collected air quality data and used those data to generate advocacy messaging that was targeted as policy decision makers in their cities. And so we actually had youth from each of these cities at COP and presenting that. And that was, I think that was a really impactful. It seems like a side thing, but again, speaking to the point of building the community of practice from a very early stage and building that pipeline of people who are already starting to work in civil society, in government, in academia, in practice, having this kind of exposure to look at the sheer potential for the ways that they actually can influence the negotiations and the conversations was really remarkable.
Thank you, Tolu. And then I'm just going to bring back Patrick and Dan. In relation to moving the needle, as Tolu mentioned, is there sort of anything in the language you notice or people visiting your pavilion that you saw is like, oh yeah, this is actually changing, or just people using different languages but trying to mean the same? So if you...
So one of the things that I was surprised by, and this is coming back to the point about what's COP going to be like in Dubai, is that the Prime Minister of the UAE in the plenary session spent a solid 5 minutes on green gas. And that's something that I had never heard of before. And I think that's coming from an energy perspective, the energy crisis that is currently happening in Europe. You know, there's a big conversation right now. Is this making the transition towards green technologies faster, or is it actually getting in the way? And so I think that, for me at least, it was very confusing to go to COP and be hearing people talk about green fossil fuels and how you can have greener coal, things like that. I thought that's completely missing the point, frankly. But that is something that is spoken about, especially in the energy part of COP. So I think that, I don't know if that's answering your question necessarily, but you know, it was something that was there, and it's not necessarily conducive to the end goal. And I think that ties also to your question about, you know, why do we have all these other things? At the end of the day, energy is the main emitter of greenhouse gases. Energy we use for human activity and for development, you know, everything you can think of, food security, water security, access to healthcare, access to education, it's all about energy. And that's why I think it was very interesting to have all these other perspectives at what many people call the African COP, because, you know, these countries are thinking more about development than they are about climate change. So having that perspective, I think, just opens the conversation a lot more.
Thank you. And Dominic?
Sure, yeah. So there's the perennial problem people have with COP, which is summarized in fast words, slow action. So people leave COP and think, okay, where should I build? Where should I dig? But like my co-panelists have spoken to just now, that's not really the point of COP. The COP is very much the tide on which pushes the ships, which gets us to net zero, I guess, to summarize. But to touch on your point of language specifically, you mentioned earlier on Friday and Saturday, the hurried rush for the negotiations. So there were several people in the nuclear pavilion who were trying to have many hurried discussions with the people having these negotiations, because if you read the draft, it was drive for renewables to combat climate change. But renewables rules out blue hydrogen, it rules out nuclear, it rules out the use of carbon capture. So the language is important, and it's in clarifying the language, as you mentioned earlier, and making sure everyone's all on the same page with that language, where we can take things forward and start building actionables. COP doesn't write actionables, it writes the framework on which actionables are written.
Thank you. Now, we have time for one more question. We've got a few questions. Let's see. So let's hear the three of them, and hopefully we'll be able to summarize them. Okay.
Hi, I had a quick question in regards to the damage and loss fund and where the role of like BRICS and other rapidly emerging economies take place in that, because there's been some talk about whether or not China will be a benefactor or a funder of the fund. And I do think there's several other countries in the 2020s or 2030s which will really emerge as large, pretty developed economies. And it's not really clear to me, and I was curious on your perspective on like to what, like when do you decide a country is developed versus developing?
Thank you. And then the other two questions, let's see if we can put them all into a package.
Thank you. In relation to the last person, I don't know your name, sorry. It's quite interesting, we've touched on it a few times. Actually, it was about the fact that the hurried discussions were in the last 2 days, and it's kind of a thing that's been on the news where I suppose a lot of people will be asking the question, you know, are these discussions properly being had? Is real progress actually being made? And I think that's the key word that I've taken away from tonight, the word progress, because if the first 3-4 days they're being quite laissez-faire and they're not actually making much progress, then quite simply what are those days being used for rather than just having some nibbles and quick chats? So quite frankly, the fact that they had to hurry many discussions in the last 2 days is quite a negative thing, and the fact that that isn't being talked about more, I think, is quite worrying. So my question to you is, as soon as they get there, should they start having these serious talks, or are we going to have constant repeats where COP28, COP29, etc. will just be constant hurried discussions?
And the last question? And I could answer that one very quickly, but we'll go for the next question.
My question was there a space to talk about migration and climate refugees?
Okay. So now very quickly in relation to the second question, is because everything is built in consensus. So basically, you know, you put your point across, and then everybody put your point across, and then it has to be a consensus. And that's what takes a very long time to decide. It's not that it's not happening, it's just everybody has to like basically agree. So that's one of the reasons why it takes so long. And in relation to, so let's see, let's tackle the BRIC one first, the role of BRICS in loss and damage and in relation to the fund, and then we can move to the migration question. So, sorry, can you still hear me? So who would like to start first? Okay, go ahead.
So I have a couple of comments on this, and I come from this again from an energy perspective. The fact of the matter is that China doesn't pollute that much in terms of per capita CO2 emissions. Frankly, their emissions per capita are below the global average. So if we're talking about, you know, transitioning and what countries should get help and what countries shouldn't get help, I think the focus has to be on, you know, the punitive part of the loss and damage fund should be on the countries that have caused the most harm historically. It's one thing to say, you know, China has been contributing since roughly 1970s, whilst other countries have been, you know, producing CO2 for over a century. So I think that that's something that is lost. And I think Dominic will remember this. We went to a talk from 3 US senators. It was Markey from Massachusetts, White House from, where was the White House from?
Rhode Island.
Rhode Island, yes. I always forget Rhode Island. And Cardin from Maryland. And their thing was, you know, we support loss and damage fund, we support funding developing countries, transitioning, et cetera, but it's China, China, China. You know, they spent more time attacking China than they did focusing on funding and like making solutions for other countries. So I think that's a very valid question. I don't think there's anything specific maybe in the agreement about this, but it's something that has to be considered, and I think that's one of the challenges with the fund.
Thank you. I know you have to leave in a few minutes. So before we head to Nina, Tolu will give you the mic.
Yeah, I just wanted to take my thoughts on the last question around migration and displacement. I think that's a really critical point. It's to some extent included under, well, it is included under thinking about loss and damage, because a really critical part of that are the impacts of displacement due to climate events, and the resource implications of that. I do agree with you. I mean, I think colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that perhaps there's not sufficient emphasis on that, particularly from a context of the well-being aspects of the implications of migration and displacement. I would say that the other aspect where it was prominent was particularly in the small island developing states, and particularly in the Pacific regions. There was a lot of emphasis and advocacy around that, because these countries are physically disappearing, right? And in terms of, this is not just individual level or neighborhood level displacement, but this is nationwide displacement on at that level. So there was quite a lot of and that is usually the case, right? There's quite a lot of advocacy and focus around the urgency, particularly for these countries, and not just for mitigation, but recognizing that for them, to some extent, it's actually too late, and that we have to think very practically about what happens in the next 40 years for countries that disappear, where you actually have to relocate huge amounts of people. And I don't think we're there yet, but I think that's a really, really critical point that was raised. So thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you, Tolu. And then Nina, you have your hand raised.
A couple of comments across the spectrum. So starting with COPs are amazingly complex beasts. I mean, if anybody wants to go down that hole, go into the UNFCCC website and look at all the documents that are negotiated throughout COP. There are, in the first week, there are a huge amount of negotiations happening to negotiate the feed-in documents, and we only then get to the negotiation of the cover text. And historically, almost all COPs have been late. This has not been the longest one. It's one of the longer ones, but it hasn't been the longest one. So they don't usually actually finish on Friday. There's always hope, but it doesn't really happen like that. In terms of historical emissions, so if you look at the carbon brief analysis from 2021, the highest historical emitter is US, 20% of the share of historical emissions, followed by China with 11% of the share of historical emissions, then Russia, Brazil, Indonesia. Now, which effectively paints a picture of who's responsible for which emissions. However, there was to come back to the loss and damage point, there was quite an interesting discussion around exactly this point: is how do we currently classify developed versus developing countries? And currently it's based upon, I think it's 1992 Rio classification. And quite clearly what was where the border was in 1992 is very different to where the border is right now. And obviously certain countries are arguing against reclassification. My understanding from what I've heard that, for example, that China is not arguing against reclassification because it wants to take the money for loss and damage, but it doesn't want to be made to pay. And there's a difference there, whereas being a recipient versus having mandatory obligations placed upon it. What has happened historically is when, for example, US makes a commitment to pay, China historically has voluntarily matched that commitment or has gone slightly above. I think the argument here is the mandatory element of it. Yes, absolutely, we need to think about actually where that loss and damage is taking place, and which are the most vulnerable countries that actually need that funding directed to it. That absolutely needs to be discussed, and there will be a long, I suspect, negotiation around who exactly is in which pot. But it is a point of contention on how where does the money need to go from where to where. But we also currently are talking quite a bit about public money. There was another initiative announced at COP, which was Global Shield, which is climate risk disaster financing, which is effectively setting up an insurance mechanism to allow most vulnerable countries to recover much quicker when climate impacts do happen.
Thank you, Nina. And Tejas?
Yeah, I think just to clarify on the loss and damage fund, the negotiations as they closed, from what I understand, are very firm on the fact that it will not be a punitive fund under any circumstances. So it's not being looked at as being reparations for historical emissions. The loss and damage fund, the only reason they were able to come to an agreement on that was because it was agreed that it will not be, even though it's ultimately the pipeline will look that way, it is never going to be treated as reparations for historical emissions. It's going to be treated as we need to figure out how to get money to people who require it as a result of loss and damage. And the most evident piece for that is what the EU negotiating bloc said, which is basically we recognize our responsibility for historical emissions, but we're going to set up a loss and damage fund so that, because it's the right thing to do. So it's a moral obligation that they've now converted into a legal obligation. But as Nina mentioned there's no legal obligation on states that are trying to get funds out of the loss and damage fund, like China, to contribute to any fund moving forward. That's the first thing. The second bit that I think is critical to remember about the loss and damage fund is that it feeds into the broader narrative of climate finance. So Nina already pointed out how there is the global shield, but also negotiations are advancing on Article 6 more broadly and markets around that, which could play a very big role in how climate finance shapes up. And the other bit to also look out for is what ends up becoming a definition for climate finance. There was a point in the negotiations in week 1 where they wanted to hit pause on everything just to figure out what the definition for climate finance would be, because they wanted to figure out a way to shoehorn loss and damage into that definition. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes, because that might also be an alternative source to claim money for things moving forward.
Thank you, Tejas. And we're sort of running out of time now. So just before we go, one word for hopefully, suppose for the future or for the next COP, whichever way you want to take it. So Beverly, one word, how would you sort of feel or summarize for next year?
All right. I mean, I've got to say, I've got to be hopeful. I'm ever hopeful, and I think it's, I don't know whether to say more than that, really. I've mentioned about what I see as some of the failures and where we need to get to, but I've got to hope that we will actually get there.
Thank you. So we'll get there. Brilliant. Patrick?
Honestly, I'd go with skeptical. This was my first COP. Coming from a nuclear point of view, it was very positive in some senses, but there's a lot of things that counterweight that. So we'll see how it goes.
Okay, so we'll get there skeptical. Nina?
Do the work now. Let's not wait for the next COP.
So that's good. Like speed up. And then Tejas?
I'd say my word is mindful. The COP only happens for 2 weeks. So
excellent. And then last but not least?
One word, if I can hyphenate, is design-oriented.
Excellent. So thank you very much. It's been a great panel, great conversation. And then for the people here in person, we can still keep chatting until 8 o'clock. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.